Hello and welcome to my FinCon presentation. My name's Rebecca Greig, and today I'm going to be talking about how personal finance journalists and bloggers can cover political events in a timely, sensitive and intelligent way. Just how should you be covering COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, the US election and other deeply polarizing events that have the power to affect millions, if not billions, and influence how we spend, and what we have to spend? To dismiss these events is to be left out of a very important part of the online conversation. But to cover them in the wrong way risks alienating your audience and losing ad revenue. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit more about myself, and then consider why you need to cover politics at all, in fact, why it's now more relevant than ever, and how you can do it in a way that feels right for you and for your site or podcast. Then I'll give you a few examples about covering these topics in my own work and look at how you can deal with criticism. So let me start by telling you a little bit about myself and why I think I'm qualified to talk about this subject. I'm the managing editor of 4 US personal finance and investing titles, and they are Money Under 30, which targets millennials and Generation Z and provides them with personal finance information and guides, Roller, which is for a slightly older demographic in personal finance. Then we have Investor Junkie, which, as the name suggests, is for people who with a more narrow focus on investing. And last, but certainly not least, there's Consumerism Commentary, which aims to take complex personal finance education and ideas and simplify them for consumers. So, as you can probably tell from that, my bread and butter is personal finance and investing. But the truth is that there's another story behind that. I've spent more than a decade working as a correspondent, reporter and producer, covering all kinds of political events around the world. These have included things like the 2016 US election, the UK Brexit referendum in the same year, the European refugee crisis, which saw 1 million Syrians arrive in Germany, and on top of that, I've covered multiple conflicts in Israel and in Gaza, and even Maoist uprisings in Nepal. Now, you don't have to cover the really big global events to know that politics and covering politics comes with its own unique set of challenges. Unlike finance, in politics, everyone has an opinion and everyone thinks their opinion is right. I really remember one of my first days working as a producer on a politics and current affairs program. Now, this dates me, but it was my job to open the letters. Yes, this is a time when people still sent letters, and I would open one letter from a viewer, which would inform me that the presenter of the show was a raving communist who shouldn't be allowed on air. I would then open another letter, which would inform me, based on the same TV debate, I should add, that the presenter was an undeniable fascist who shouldn't be allowed on air. This is just one of many examples. When I was covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I was routinely told by both Israelis and Palestinians that I was obviously supporting the other side. And more recently in my career, a few Money Under 30 readers objected to the wording of a newsletter that related to events around the Black Lives Matter movement. After we sent out an apology, we then received more messages from readers objecting to our apology. As a friend once put it to me, well, if both sides hate you, you must be doing something right. As a personal finance writer, you might now be thinking, well, why do I need to cover politics at all? I mean, it's very easy to say, well, focus on finance and stay away from politics. But really, it's just not that easy. You might be familiar with the expression, the personal is political, which was a mantra of 1970s feminism. Well, I am here to tell you folks, personal finance is political too. Everything about personal finance relates to money. The taxes you pay, for example, are determined by political policies. In fact, that the stock market is doing really well when millions of people are unemployed. Well, that's a result of political policies designed to prop up the Dow Jones. And policies that are enacted by cities and states and federal government really affect how people interact with money and also the kinds of choices they have. We really need to remember that generational wealth has compounding effects just like savings and investments. Everybody in the personal finance world loves to talk about their success, and who can blame them? But we often really, the problem is we fail to consider the extreme privilege that we are born with. Let's look at it in a different way. When you vote, and every time you vote, you're voting for policies that affect your finances in one way or another. As financial independence blogger Melanie Allen has discussed on her site, Partners in Fire, there are many, many things that are personal finance, but also intrinsically political. For example, let's talk about healthcare. Or should we? It's a very thorny topic, and regardless of whether you're a Bernie bro or a Biden fan or a Trump supporter, every politician has a very, very different strategy for reducing the costs of healthcare through policy. And again, what about salaries? Well, minimum wage policy is set by local governments, and obviously policies can affect people's earnings in a real way. What about education? At Money Under 30, student loan debt is a major topic and a major concern for many of our readers. Now, governments can enact different policies on the cost of education, which directly affects whether people are able to go to university and where they do go to study. What about taxes? We've already mentioned that. And we know that taxes are one of those things that, along with death, are an inevitability. Well, taxes are certainly financial, but they're also political. Certain policies will increase your tax burden, while others will lower it. What about interest rates? Well, the Fed generally controls interest rates. And of course they do strive to be apolitical. But we must remember that interest rates are based on financial policy and how it's affecting the economy. So it means that the amount of interest that you are paying on savings accounts or earning on savings accounts and the amount of interest you're paying on debt is all political if you dig deep enough. And what about the issue of social security? The FIRE movement is obviously a huge area that we talk about a lot in personal finance. Well, will social security be available when you reach retirement age? Is it something that you're planning to receive or planning to lose? This is a very important aspect of retirement planning, and it's also political. There are also other things to consider, like social welfare programs, again financial, but also political. And what about trade? Trade policy has a huge effect on consumer prices. You might be paying more for certain items due to higher tariffs, and you might even lose your job due to lower tariffs. These are policies which directly affect citizens every day, but if we don't notice or we're not paying attention, how can we make any intelligent comment on them? We can't. And that leads me also to talk about workers' rights. Again, you might think, well, what do they affect? How do they affect me? But the truth is that workers' rights in government policy are what gave us things like, at least theoretically, a 40-hour working week and also banned child labour in most of the developed world. It also gave people the right to unionise and demand higher pay and safer working conditions. These are all things which focus on money, but also are deeply political. And they also allow us, these workers' rights, to actually have a life outside of work and pursue your own side hustles. In my case, baking brownies after dark. You can't escape these things, even if you want to. And let's be honest here, 2020 is a year that many people would be very happy to see the back of. We can't ignore the fact that we're living through a global pandemic, an election year with more divisions in society than almost ever before, nationwide and international protests amid global recession brought on, at least in part, by the strict shutdown policies that governments have undertaken to curb the spread of coronavirus. And we can clearly see how different policies affect different people differently, according to where you live or what job you have, and many other factors which touch on difficult issues and the intersection between race, class, and wealth. If you decide not to cover any of these issues in your work, then you have to realise that you're not covering the issues that are likely to matter most to your audience. Despite the turmoil in the world, in fact, I think partly because of it, people are more interested in personal finance than almost ever before. People are really concerned with how to protect their money. They want to know how to save. People who've never invested want to invest. They want to safeguard their home or their job, or maybe find a new job or home. And so all of these things work together to affect people's behaviour. Political events have very personal effects. And I'm here to really tell you a little bit more about how to cover some of these sensitive issues in a way that doesn't alienate your audience, but draws them in and helps them to understand that your site or blog or podcast is really part of the national conversation. Now, I don't want your site or podcast to face a barrage of criticism and invective. So how do you cover these things in a non-partisan or sensitive way? Well, depending on the size of your site, blog, and how many other people you work with, I would recommend drafting an editorial policy for these events, because consistency on your site or blog is very important. Now, of course, you may already have a blog which takes a partisan stand, and as long as you state your position on the blog, I don't see that as a problem. I mean, it may even work to your advantage. For example, if you're a financial blogger and person of colour, you may want to cover the Black Lives Matter movement in a political way, or look at the way that coronavirus and job losses are affecting the Black community. As a feminist blogger, you might want to cover the pay gap and look at specific ways to help women financially. Now, FinCon is very lucky to have had speakers and many articles focusing on these subjects from a wide variety of people. And if you haven't already, and this is not just a shameless plug, I recommend you check out FinCon's excellent resources on diversity and anti-racism. But hang on, you're saying. I want to attract a widest audience as possible, from all walks of life, men and women, white and black, and I want to reach out across the political divide. Well, if you are a site which makes your money from affiliate marketing, as so many of us are, you do have to tread carefully. You don't want to lose ad revenue. As we know too well, brands really would be very wary of associating themselves with content that appears to take a political stance or is controversial. You know, it's for this reason that politics is sometimes even, shall I say it, a dirty word on personal finance sites and forums. You know, we turn on the TV and we can see political allegiances are dividing a nation. And we all know it can be very hard to separate politics and emotions. We've all been there at the Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner where Uncle Rob and Auntie Jo fell out 20 years ago because of how they voted in the '92 election. Political debates can frequently descend into very personal attacks. And even political discourse over policy can quickly morph into partisan politics. None of us is without bias. You can start with a statement on healthcare, and very quickly it will turn into an anti-liberal or anti-conservative diatribe. Sometimes it may even seem easier to create an all-out ban of these topics, rather than facilitating a healthy, sensitive, and kind conversation. What we do know is that many influencers in the personal finance sphere choose to avoid any whiff of politics. You might focus on the factors that people can control and will appeal to people regardless of political affiliation, like, for example, making a budget or downloading a financial planning app. Now, if you stick to these safe topics, I don't blame you. No one wants to get cancelled by any portion of their audience for having the wrong political view. So instead you might focus on investing or financial tools that everybody can agree on. But if you always swerve difficult topics, you're also missing out on the potential rewards that they can bring and the huge gains in social media, branding, and engagement. So, how do you cover political events in a neutral way? Well, let's take a look at the definition of neutrality. To write neutrally is to lay out all sides of any disputed question without asserting, implying, or insinuating that any one side is correct. If a debated point is mentioned, you represent the state of the debate rather than taking a stand. Now, there are a few ways of doing this. One way is to cover political events with a narrow economic focus, looking at where the money goes and where it comes from and how this specific event that you're discussing affects people's pockets. You're avoiding making any kind of snap judgment and you stick to the facts and statistics. But what if you want to touch on more emotive subjects? Well, rather than imposing your opinion, let people tell their own stories. Now, how does this work in action? Let me share with you a few of the topics and stories I've worked on for Money Under 30. Earlier this year, we collected the personal testimonies of tens of millennials and young Americans between the ages of 18 and 39, and we also surveyed more than 2,000 young people to find out how their spending habits and financial behaviours have been affected by COVID-19. Well, firstly, we let the statistics speak for themselves. Unemployment rates, which were pre-COVID at a 50-year low, skyrocketed to a post-World War II high, and some 20 million jobs have fallen off payrolls since February. Now, given that kind of context, I am the very first to admit that I was very surprised when the results of the survey came in, and I saw that 2 out of 3, 65% of millennials, said that the lockdown actually was having a positive effect on their finances. But it was very important to present the results of the polls as we got them. So 69% of people said that overall they spent less and they saved on barista brewed coffee and dinner out, as well as the rideshare taxi home. However, that was only one part of the story, and that was the statistics. The other part was the interviews. Now, our interviews told a rather different and a much more mixed story. We spoke to millennials who told us that yes, actually, lockdown for them had been enormously positive and they had saved a lot of money and were focusing on things that were more important to them. And if you're one of those people, that's great. But obviously, that's not the whole story. It was impossible for me to ignore the story of Rennie Turner, a 35-year-old black single mother and wheelchair user who lost her job as a result of the pandemic. Over the phone, she told me how, as a disabled black woman, she was a triple minority and subject to discrimination in the form of sexism, racism, and ableism. Now, it's very hard to read or hear Rennie's story without thinking of the political implications. Firstly, she lost her job in a pandemic. Secondly, as a wheelchair user, she's limited to the kinds of roles she can take on. And due to the American healthcare and social security system, she lost her health insurance when she lost her job. But if her unemployment benefits are too high, she may not qualify for Medicaid. Now, as a result, she developed a GoFundMe page to raise money for a mobility scooter that in different countries, like the UK or most of Europe, for example, would have been given to her as part of the system of universal healthcare. Now, despite these many features, which obviously can be politicised, we let the facts and Rennie speak for themselves without drawing overt political conclusions. In another piece that we published more recently, we compared the policies of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But we were very strict in looking in the areas of student loans, taxes, and healthcare, which were the areas most interesting and most relevant to our millennial audience. We took extra care in this piece not to give any opinion, we left that up to our audience, and we focused on the number crunching. We looked at how Trump's and Biden's standings on key financial issues affected millennials' bottom line. Now, because this was a very delicate piece, and we didn't want a lot of criticism, we had multiple editors and colleagues look over the piece, and we made sure they were of varying political hues to ensure that the piece did not sway left or right, and in the end, we were pleased and also perhaps a little bit surprised not to receive any complaints from our readers. But of course, as we've discussed, sometimes criticism is unavoidable. And you may, despite trying to remain a cool, impartial observer, some of your readers may think differently and react badly and accuse you of bias. Well, just like an argument with a friend or a spouse, it's important to know when and how to apologise and when to stand your ground. If you feel the criticism is justified, that perhaps you've overlooked some nuances of your content and perhaps it can be interpreted in a biased or partisan way, the first thing to do is to carefully draft an apology that recognises the nature of your wrongdoing and the hurt you have hopefully inadvertently caused, and the steps you can undertake to not commit the same mistake again. However, sometimes, despite the best efforts of you and your colleagues, if you work with colleagues, people will take umbrage with some of your content because of their own very particular way of looking at the world. In this case, you can still respond to the criticism, but you can do so in a way that both underscores your commitment to the reader and your commitment to presenting the facts as you see them in an unvarnished way. How do you do this, and what kind of language you use? Well, both of these things are very important. And George Orwell, the English author of 1984, had quite a lot to say about this in his famous essay, Politics and the English Language. And he was not that optimistic, and he described, rather warningly, the relationship between politics and what he called the debasement of the English language. And what he said was, as soon as certain topics are raised, the concrete melts into the abstract, and no one seems able to think of turns of speech that are not hackneyed. Prose consists less and less of words chosen for the sake of their meaning, and more of phrases tacked together like the sections of a prefabricated henhouse. Now, what does that mean to personal finance writers and bloggers writing today? That means you need to take care with your writing, avoiding unoriginal or mixed metaphors, abstract or meaningless language. And if you do those things, you're at least halfway there. Ultimately, only you can make the right decision about the content for you and your site or blog. You may choose to neatly sidestep all references, either overt or subvert, to politics or any personal finance topics with a political slant. The purpose of my talk is really to teach you that in the personal finance sphere, politics is not a four-letter word. In fact, if used in the right way, it can boost your engagement and help you to produce the kind of timely, interesting content that goes to the heart of what matters most to people every day. The rest is up to you. Thank you very much.